Hello and welcome to today's video where I will be covering the spring split in total when it comes to most common champion matchups. If you are new to the channel, which you probably are because I've gotten a influx of a ton of subscribers the last 48 hours. Um, the Hello and welcome to this video where I will be covering the most common matchups that occurred in the spring split across the four major regions, that being LCS, LEC, LPL, and LCK. Looking at what the meta what the meta for the entire spring split was, and we're going to have some throwbacks here. Right now we have a lot of Gwen. There hasn't been a lot of Gwen lately. That's because she was nerfed to Oblivion, and she's only a pocket pick now. But she was the most common champion picked in top lane. So that's what these videos are going to be about. It's going to be about not these videos, this video, which I'll have in 5 parts, all edited together. Um, what did we see this spring? What were the handshake matchups? How did they look? How does it look versus how that matchup looked in solo queue throughout the split? I did videos all split long for each patch, recapping them. I did 2 this past weekend when the LPL was done with 12.5 and the LCS was done with 12.6. The 12.6 video obviously didn't have a lot of information on it because really the LCS playoffs was all that 12.6 was, so there wasn't a lot of information to go off of. But here, we're going to go over some matchups just briefly and touch on them. So, top lane, like I said, a lot of Gwen. We have Gwen and Graves. So, Gwen was the pick, and then it was, how do you want to play against a Gwen? Do you want to play Jace against Gwen or Graves against Gwen? That makes sense. You have a carry against a skill matchup. It's a really skilled matchup in the end between a carry versus skill-based champ. Gnar versus Gwen, kind of tanky, but not really Gnar versus the Gwen. Very similar champions in that way. Obviously, one being AD and one being AP, but still similar nonetheless. Gragas, we know what Gragas is. One of the safer tanks if you want to build that way. It leaves you a lot of options going AP Glass Cannon Gragas versus the tank Gragas pick. And Gragas actually did very, very well against Gwen across spring, 59%. Actually, looking at this, Gwen was not a good pick across the 4 major regions. Jace winning 3 out of 4 games against it. That's pretty impressive. Gragas, 59%, that's pretty significant. Graves versus Gwen was a coin flip. Gnar versus Gwen was a coin flip. Jace versus Graves, when you had 2 carries against each other, Gwen was banned. And you go with Graves versus Jace, coin flip. When you get into solo queue, Graves dominated. Graves didn't dominate, but had a slight win rate over Gwen and Jace. Jace having a slight win rate over Gwen. It was very close. The highest here in Plat was 52%. So really, most matchups were coin flips, and that's kind of typical in Plat. Everybody. What you know what Plat is. You know what the Plat players are like. Very coin flippy, not very consistent, and losing is not a surprise on whatever champion you're playing. Challenger level, though, you see Gwen take over against Jason Graves. The more skilled players piloting the Gwen earlier in the split, obviously taking it to victory. And obviously, these solo queue numbers are off of LOLalytics.com, I believe. I think it's .com. I used their site for patch-by-patch breakdowns of champion matchups. Gwen actually had a really strong win rate against Graves, 56% in Challenger, which is nice. Obviously, people probably picking the Graves, maybe junglers trying it top lane, or top laners. It being a newer champion to top lane, maybe not a lot of top laners that even played Graves all that much. And then you see Gnar with a 58% win rate over Gwen in Challenger. In the end, Gwen is a champion that you have to be skilled to play well. We know that. I'm not surprised that Gwen has a strong win rate against a Jason and Graves, because a Jason and Graves is more of a carry, very, very true carry oriented champion. You have to be very good to pilot the Graves, and the Jace and carry to a win. Obviously, NA, LEC, West overall, Jace is a meme. I don't even think Jace was really picked all that much in the LEC this split. Um, and it's because they are not really good at Jace. So I'm sure that influenced these numbers quite a bit. Um, I mean, and then you have, like I said, why I talked about that, Gnar versus Gwen. Gnar being an easier champion to pilot overall than the Gwen when you're in that matchup where they're very similar champions. They're trying to do similar things. Gnar being more of an initiator, obviously, but they both, are kind of bruiser champions that approach the game from an AD and AP standpoint, but both have a similar, goal in mind and what they're trying to do on the Rift. So that's kind of how I viewed. I mean, I didn't even not necessarily how I viewed. I mean, how I viewed these matchups. But these are the top and most common top matchups from the spring split in the four major regions, 12.1 through 12.6. Now on to the jungle. Okay, now for the jungle, clearly a lot of Xin Zhao, a lot of Lee Sin. That was the common matchup we saw all split long. I'm sure you saw it even in your region and other regions for that matter. Even all the way to the bitter end, Lee Sin and Viego were really common. We saw some Trundle, Volibear, the occasional Hecarim, Poppy. As you see here, Jarvan became really popular towards the end of the split. And Xin Zhao, like I said, is pretty much out of the split now. But this just shows how big of a prio pick it was to begin the split. 102 times we saw Lee Sin versus Xin Zhao. And I mean, my stats have to be wrong. I mean, I had it 51 to 51. I mean, that's pretty damn incredible if that happened. But you see here, Xin Zhao was the strong champion against a Viego. Viego was not a strong champion across the split overall. Losing out to Xin Zhao and Lee Sin. I mean, Viego was a poor counter pick. We saw counter picks that made sense, especially, I keep referencing patch 12.5 because it's fresh in my mind. If you view that video, you'll see in the jungle section of that video, there are clearly counters that were there for players to use. And it was typical, like the triangle, how a triangle would work. This champion beats this champion, but this champion is better against this champion. And obviously, there's a plethora of reasons why each matchup goes the way it does, down to how good the player is, the team, the jungler, everything. But this is why you look at it from an outside perspective. Across 102 matchups, this is how it looked. And it's different than saying in one individual matchup, how to determine what champion may be better than the other in pro play. But Viego was weak. Hecarim was coin flippy against Xin Zhao, 51%. J4 was a good, solid counter against Xin Zhao, especially towards the end of the split. Jarvan became a really good pick. I saw a lot of players winning with it. The hard CC is hard to ignore. 54%. However, in solo queue, you see here Xin Zhao dominates 53% against Lee Sin, 55% against Lee Sin, 55% against Hecarim. Like, Xin Zhao was a strong pick in solo queue for a lot of us at the Plat and Challenger level. People building him differently depending on the matchup. It gave you a lot of options and what your team might need. The team can play around it better, and it makes sense to have a stronger win rate against a Lee Sin because a Lee Sin takes a lot of setup, it takes a lot of skill, and you need your team on board with what you're doing. I'm surprised Hecarim wasn't higher, honestly, in solo queue because I feel like Hecarim can carry games at times. And I'm not surprised that it beat the Jarvan because Jarvan can set up, but somebody has to finish. And in a pro setting, it works well because players can finish, but in solo queue, not so much. So that's kind of it for jungle. I mean, it's a lot different than what top lane looked like, obviously, 102 to 46. Like, we clearly had the same champions over and over and over again, whereas in top lane, you had a more variety of champions. I want to say it was like 55 champions in top lane overall for this split. So, it's nice to see a lot of pizzazz. Hopefully that pizzazz continues in MSI. Like I said in my video this morning over the Istanbul Wildcats, teams in the smaller regions need to get a little cheesy, pick pocket picks that they like in a matchup that the other team may not expect. That's the sort of stuff that's going to get you wins in a tournament like this, especially best of ones. So that's that for jungle. Now on to mid lane. Okay, now with mid lane's a lot more like top lane. The solo lanes having a wider variety of champions to choose from. We clearly see, and we all remember, Corki versus Victor to start the split. It was very common to see Corki versus Victor, especially in the eastern regions in the LPL and LCK. Very handshaky. Really, mid lane was handshaky. And I think we all know what that means. You pick Corki, I pick Victor. You pick Rise, I pick Orianna. You know, it's the same champions because that's it. To put the control mages in mid. You pick Rise, well, I want to move with you. TF kind of stinks. We're going with Galio. I can build Galio like a tank like Rise if I want to, and I can build it AP if I want to, and I can match you however I want to. And Galio actually did very well against Rise across the split. Towards the end, it was opposite, but most of the split, Rise actually struggled against Galio. Actually, Rise struggled against Victor as well, big time. Victor was super strong against Rise to begin this split, especially in the LCK. I want to say something like double digits before Rise got like a few wins. Maybe it's like the 15 out of like 11 out of 15 or something crazy. Don't quote me on those stats, but it was something really crazy in Korea that Victor was dominating Rise, and that's why it's 76% because it was just crazy gap. Obviously, over time, when Doomby was able to do the tank Rise build, everyone else started building Everfrost, and now that's the meta. But at the time, in the beginning of the patch, many months ago, in the beginning of the split, that's how it was. So, Corki, slight win rate over Victor. Orianna, barely better than Rise. Victor, very strong against Rise. Galio, very strong against Rise. Ori, better than Victor. When people picked Ori, problem was, usually people would pick... if they went Victor and you didn't answer Corki during the first rotation, people might ban the Orianna through the second rotation and eliminate the possibility of you picking it. Obviously, the other two control mages that aren't on this list, Syndra, Azir, were just not part of the spring meta. But I would really be surprised if Syndra and Azir, actually Azir I think got buffed recently. I wouldn't be surprised if they came around for summer because that's just like the handshaky agreement sort of, matchup that Riot would push. And then we have Ari versus LeBlanc. I wanted to keep the top 5 up here. Ari versus LeBlanc are tied at 28 matchups, and that was very recent. Ari, over the second half of the split, became a big champion, and I think in the beginning a lot of people were hesitant to pick it because they're like, Ari sucks. Might be dominating solo queue, but overall it sucks. Well, no. It was a draw against LeBlanc, a very good counter against LeBlanc. We saw Vigar also picked against these champions to a lesser degree. But Ari obviously dominated in solo queue at 56 and 59%. Makes sense. Ari is a really good solo queue champion if you know how to pilot it. I'm not surprised that Orianna, has a strong win rate against Rai. I'm not surprised Rai struggles in solo queue. Similar to the Lee Sin situation with jungle, you need other players around you to make Rise useful. Especially with a tank Rise. Now you're not dealing damage, you're trying to make plays, but you're going to go realm warp onto another lane to a guy that you haven't been able to really communicate with, that doesn't know you're coming or may not be on the same page as you exactly, and you don't get a kill. And you don't get the impact that a pro player would in the same play. So Rise struggling in solo queue makes sense. Orianna struggling at a plat level in some matchups makes sense, especially against the Victor. Ori, I think, is a little bit harder of a champion to use than Victor. Manipulating the ball, doing what you have to do, timing your shockwaves well. It makes sense that Ori may be a little more difficult, and that's why at a challenger level, Ori actually wins over the Victor. And even in pro play. Because, Victor is, I think you're kind of settling on Victor. You settle on Victor. Kind of like you settle on Corki. Just like, yeah, we're going to go with the scaling champion here. And Corki, I think the joke was in the LCK too, was like, after 35 minutes, Corky is going to win the game, and it doesn't matter what you have. If you have Soul, if you have Elder, it doesn't matter. Corky is going to dominate the game, and I mean it was true in the beginning of the split, and thank God Corky is no longer like that because it was really boring. I hate watching 40-minute games, in most cases, especially in the LCK. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of the mid meta from this spring. I mean, it was a lot of handshaky agreement matchups, and it's only going to get more handshaky in a minute when we go to bot lane. Okay, now on to bot lane. Like I said, handshake, Aphelios versus Jinx. Some people have stuck with me since the beginning. You will know Aphelios versus Jinx was super common throughout the entire spring split. It was not even overtaken in the last split, 12.5. I mean, 12.6 is in here, but I'm not counting 12.6. Excuse me, in what I just said, because, I mean, the LCS were the only teams that were playing when LPL and LPL were using Aphelios till the bitter end. 309 times we saw Aphelios versus Jinx. Jinx 55% win rate. Jinx was really strong towards the end of the on 12.5. I think it was like 65% win rate or something crazy. Ends up being 55. Zeri, when Zeri was hot, she dominated, and she did. She dominated Jinx 64% of the time. We saw when Jinx was banned, especially towards the later stages of the split, Xayah became a high prio pick into Aphelios and Jinx. You see here, Aphelios 57%, Jinx 54%. It was kind of like, okay, well, we're going to try Xayah, and it wasn't. I mean, the problem was Xayah itself was okay. It was how people built her. Some people really couldn't figure out how other people were doing it. I mean, in solo queue, it was pretty much the same thing. Jinx was stronger than Xayah in solo queue. Xayah was stronger than Aphelios at a plat level. That's not a surprise, though. I mean, I feel like Aphelios is a champion that takes a lot of, a lot of effort, a lot of practice to do really, really well at the higher levels of solo queue. So it having a weak win rate against Jinx makes sense overall, as well as struggling at times against Xayah. Jhin being on there, a lot of people be like, why is Jhin on there? Jhin was really picked that many times, and it was. Throughout the entire split, Jhin was like a safety blanket for a lot of players, I feel like. They were like, okay, well, fine, I guess I'm going to play Jhin, and I'm going to scale and try and not die, and we'll see what happens late game. And I feel like a lot of people kind of just like, were like, okay, well, I'm going to do that. I'm going to go with Jhin. And, I mean, the win rate was not there, 64% for Jinx. It makes sense. People should have just stopped picking Jhin and started picking other things, which is kind of why the Xayah came about. But at the same time, other things should have been tried. And there were, I mean, we saw 20, 25 different champions in bot lane throughout the split. Obviously, things like Ezreal showed up. Tristana, very strong against Zeri. A lot of people overlooked the Tristana. But in the LPL, people are picking Tristana against Zeri, and it was working very well when Zeri was strong. And I don't know why other regions weren't jumping on it, because it was like, let them pick Zeri, pick Tristana. You have, obviously it's working for some people. Figure it out. And I don't understand why people weren't doing it. It wasn't getting bans forced out or nothing. It was really bizarre to see. I mean, clearly the bot meta was Aphelios Jinx, though. I mean, I kind of get all over the place with these videos because it's just, you look at the numbers and you say, wow, why did this happen? And I think it's, people just agreeing to handshake. Like, people are like, okay, we're going to go Corky Victor in mid or some kind of control mages. We're going to go Aphelios Jinx. Somebody's going to put Gwen in top, and we're going to figure out this is where we get frisky. What do we pick against Gwen? In the jungle, do we want to go with hard engage with J4? Do we want to go with Xin Zhao? Do we want to go with Lee Sin for the kick? But it was all like similar, it was all like similar, ideals of how to win the game. The win conditions were all the same. There wasn't a lot of pizzazz. And luckily, towards the end of the split, we saw some pizzazz, like I said, in mid, with Ahri and LeBlanc. We saw some Trundle and Volibear towards the end of the split as well. I mean, in bot lane, we're seeing some Xayah, which is nice. Xayah getting nerfed recently, though, I believe, so Xayah might fall back out of the meta, and it's just going to return to Jinx Aphelios, which sucks. I mean, it sucks. And hopefully maybe support will kind of make this more interesting, more supports and things like that. Because I'm going to tell you right now, we're about to go to support, and it's very similar in the way that we have the same champions all the time. Not a 309, but similar. So let's finish this up with support. Okay, now for the last part of this video, we have support. 121 times Leona versus Nautilus. Like I said, this was going to be, a lot of the same thing, and it was. Leona versus Nautilus was the handshake in the bot lane, first rotation. Now you see here, if one was left, if one was banned, the other one wasn't, you saw Rakan or Tahm Kench be picked into a Leona or a Nautilus, respectively. More so at the end of the split, we saw Tahm Kench being picked more, Rakan being picked more, especially with Xayah. Obviously, Xayah Rakan was common, or even people picking the Rakan to deny the Xayah. And, in the early part of the split, we saw a lot of Thresh. So it was Thresh as first pick in a lot of situations in 12.1, 12.2. Thresh, Aphelios Thresh was very, very common. We saw Thresh being banned. People picked Leona or Nautilus into it, and it had a strong win rate. Thresh was better than both champions in the four major regions. And after it got nerfed, I don't even know if it got nerfed. I think it just fell out of favor. Once it fell out of favor, people just stopped picking it outright. It didn't even have enough time to really drop in win rate. You see in a solo queue level, Nautilus having a slight edge over Thresh. The hard CC being the difference, both being pick champs, obviously, with their hooks. But Nautilus's ultimate having the hard CC is an advantage. We see Leona having a stronger win rate than Thresh in solo queue at a challenger level. Obviously, it's easier to hit her ultimate than, you have the box with Thresh, which is, you fillet and whatever. It clearly, you can, use Thresh's ultimate. But Leona's causes more havoc and, allows for more options. I see a lot of draws here, with Leona Nautilus, Rakan Leona at a plat level, Thresh versus Nautilus at a challenger level. It makes sense. The support role really doesn't affect the game all that much in the grand scheme of things across all of League of Legends. A lot of them do the same things. There's not really a lot of pizzazz there. The Tahm Kench being kind of interesting. You have a hard tank that is kind of different now, obviously, and it provides a little bit more pick potential, and players have figured out how to use him. And I feel like in MSI, we may see some Tahm Kench being picked and teams not being prepared for it. The support role is what could make or break MSI for a lot of these teams. Especially, you look at T1 with Keria, big dog. Ming, very, very good. PCS is Kaiwing. I really have been a fan of Kaiwing for a long time. So I'm not, at international events, I've seen him play, and I remember Kaiwing, which is a big deal. We all kind of we all know who, this player is, XYZ, but you see them over and over again. You're like, okay, this guy is going to show up on the international stage, may lose, but he's going to show up. I feel like support's going to be an important pick, especially when you have handshakes of the same matchups all the time. If you can win both sides of a matchup as a support, all of a sudden the other team is screwed. What are they going to pick against you? They have to get creative, like a Rakan or a Tahm Kench. So those are the most common matchups from spring 2022. I will be doing a video, obviously, recapping MSI when we're done, which will be, I guess, patch 12.8 rundown. We're not going to do 12.7 because, obviously, the four major regions didn't play in 12.7, so why would I do that? But this is that for this video. Comment down below if you have any opinions on champion pools, what you saw throughout the spring split. What do you think that might carry over into MSI? Do you think these handshake agreement matchups are just going to continue, even if they become very one-sided or, out of the meta? Should be out of the meta, nerfed away, but, stick around. If you didn't catch my video this morning, I covered Istanbul Wildcats. Obviously, I mean, we're covering the small dogs right now, the little teams, the underdogs. So, I mean, I did Red Canids a few days ago. I did Team A's yesterday. I did Sagan Buffalo a few days ago. I'm ranking them from what I think is 11th to 1st. Other videos I intend on doing tomorrow, I want to get my 12.7 video up where I look at all the players in MSI, the champions that got buffed or nerfed, versus, you know, what players used during the spring split to be like, okay, well, you used X champion a lot and they got nerfed, which is bad for you, or this champion got buffed and you used it a little bit this year or a couple of years ago and it was good, you used it a lot. So you have an advantage, this player has an advantage to, pull this pick out at MSI. I keep bringing up Faker's Nico. Nico has been out of the meta for a while, but we know Faker's Nico is nasty. So if Nico all of a sudden becomes buffed, which she was buffed, now is she buffed enough to play in pro play? We'll see. If she is, then all of a sudden it's like, oh crap, Faker can get creative, and that's just one example of many that we might see at MSI. So thank you for watching this video, and I hope you tune in for more content.